In today's episode, Dr. Plotkin leads us through the fascinating story of magic mushrooms. From Algeria to Mexico to Alice in Wonderland, we'll learn about the many ways these fungi have shaped cultures throughout history. Sharing lessons from indigenous peoples, Dr. Plotkin discusses the promising potential of these magic mushrooms. Unfortunately, increasingly threatened by our planet's changing climate.
On today's episode, I want to do three things. I want to talk about magic mushrooms, past, present, and future. I want to detail the history of magic mushrooms, which I saw firsthand from the inside as a student of Richard Schultes, who was one of the key figures in the Psychedelic Renaissance movement. And I also want to discuss the current situation and the future of magic mushrooms and other medical fungi. I want to begin today's episode reading my all-time favorite quotes about magic mushrooms. This is in reference to Teonanacatl, the Aztec name for flesh of the gods, since these indigenous peoples of ancient Mexico regarded magic mushrooms as a sacrament. It was to them, literally, the flesh of the gods. By consuming this flesh of the gods, you could become one with the Godhead, not unlike some aspects of Christianity, like the Eucharist and communion. The incredible quote that I'm going to read you is from Maria Sabina Magdalena Garcia, better known as Maria Sabina, the most famous healer among the Mazatec peoples of southern Mexico in the state of Oaxaca. These Mazatecs are the true mushroom masters. It was with them that Schultes worked in the late 1930s and first learned that the magic mushroom religion did indeed thrive. When the first Westerners started taking these mushrooms, they were unable to adequately describe the effect. The word that was often used was intoxicated, but intoxicated comes from toxin, meaning poisoned. Psychonauts have come up with a much better term, be-mushroomed. Let me read what Maria Sabina, the Mazatec healer, said to Gordon Wasson, the father of ethnomycology, when she was deeply be-mushroomed. Quote, "The more you go inside the world of Teonanacatl, the more things are seen. You also see your past and your future, which are there together as a single thing, already achieved, already happened. I saw stolen horses and buried cities, the existence of which was unknown, but what was going to be brought to light. Millions of things I saw and knew, and I saw God, an immense clock that ticks, the hands that go slowly around. Inside, the stars, the earth, the universe, the day and the night, the cry and the smile, the happiness and the pain. He who makes it to the end can even see that infinite clockwork." That's Maria Sabina, recorded by Wasson in the 1950s. She talked of cities that would come to light. Having had the privilege to work with colleagues in Honduras a couple of years ago, we stumbled across the ruins of what's been called, quote, the lost city of the monkey god. So in that case, I can tell you that Maria Sabina was indeed correct. There are indeed lost cities, and this one was indeed brought to light. One more great quote, because she was such a poet. Quote, "There is a world beyond ours, a world that is far away, nearby, and invisible. And there is where God lives, where the dead live, the spirits and the saints, a world where everything has already happened and everything is known. That world talks. It has a language of its own. I report what it says. The sacred mushroom takes me by the hand and brings me to the world where everything is known. It is they, the sacred mushrooms, los niños santos, that speak in a way I can understand. I ask them and they answer me. When I return from the journey that I've taken with them, I tell what they have told me and what they have shown me." Switching gears a bit, just imagine if I called a press conference tomorrow and the press gathered around and I put on the table in front of me a box and I said, quote, "In that box are magical creatures. They can feed us, they can cure us, they can kill us." They can open new vistas. They can eat petroleum. They can eat radioactive waste. They can prevent bee colony collapse. These creatures can do all of that and more. There would be three responses. The first group would say, this fellow must be a genius. The second, much larger group would say, this guy's a liar and a fool. The smallest and most knowledgeable group would be mycologists, mushroom experts, and they would say, of course they can. That box is full of magic mushrooms and other fungi. End of quote. That is how fantastic fungi are. And if you want more information on this, I strongly encourage everyone to watch the documentary film Fantastic Fungi, made in part by my good friend Bill Benison and featuring other experts on the field of mycology like Michael Pollan and Paul Stamets. It's the best movie on fungi ever made, and the accompanying book, also called Fantastic Fungi, is equally intriguing. I want to talk a bit about the history of magic mushrooms and how they launched the Psychedelic Renaissance. The story begins in 1937 when a Harvard undergraduate named Richard Schultes was researching early accounts of plant use by the indigenous peoples of Mexico as recorded by the Spanish invaders for his undergraduate thesis. Although his focus was peyote, he stumbled across numerous references to the consumption of intoxicating mushrooms, which were known as teonanacatl, as I mentioned, the flesh of the gods. While examining peyote collections in the Smithsonian Institution Herbarium, he came across a letter dated July 18, 1923, attached to a herbarium sheet addressed to the head of the herbarium from an Austrian physician residing in Mexico, which stated, I see in your description of peyote that Dr. William Safford, who was an expert in New World pre-Columbian hallucinogens, believes that this plant, peyote, to be the teonanacatl of Sahagun, which is surely wrong. It is actually, as Sahagun states, a fungus, which grows on dung heaps and which is still used under the same name by the Indians of the Sierra Juarez and Oaxaca in their religious feasts. In other words, the report by Sahagun, a Franciscan friar who conducted ethnographic research in Mexico in the early 1500s, that the indigenous peoples were employing hallucinogenic mushrooms for healing and divinatory purposes, was correct, and that the so-called expert, Safford, who claimed that the Indians were taking peyote, was incorrect. In Joseph Campbell's parlance, who often wrote of the hero's journey, Schultes' reading of that letter would be considered, quote, the call to adventure, a challenge or quest that must be undertaken. Upon finishing his college degree, Schultes enrolled in a graduate program at Harvard and then headed to Oaxaca in southern Mexico to investigate teonanacatl in 1938 as the subject of his PhD dissertation. Schultes found that the mushrooms were indeed being used for divinatory and healing purposes by the Chinantec, Mazatec, and Zapotec peoples of southern Mexico, and he published the results in 1941 in the Botanical Museum leaflets of Harvard University, which, in Schultes' own words, were, quote, a journal of extremely limited circulation. The article was read by few and had little impact until it helped launch the beginning of what we now call the Psychedelic Renaissance 9 years later. An overlooked figure in the story is Dr. Valentina Wasson, a physician married to the wealthy American banker R. Gordon Wasson. She knew and loved edible mushrooms based on childhood experiences in Russia and was directly responsible for interesting her heretofore mycophobic husband in fungi. Together, the two began studying history to determine what role fungi may have played. One topic which intrigued them, which is perhaps the ultimate cold case, was the murder of the Roman Emperor Claudius, who had supposedly been killed by his wife Agrippina when she fed him poisoned mushrooms in 54 AD. At the time the Wassons decided to seek an answer to this mycological mystery, the reigning expert on this Roman emperor was the poet and classicist Robert Graves, who had written and published a brilliant, although fictional, autobiography of the ancient Roman ruler, I Claudius, in 1937, based on a deep reading of the ancient historians Dio Cassius, Suetonius, and Tacitus. This is a wonderful book and was made into a wonderful series by the BBC, also entitled I, Claudius. Highly recommended. It was Valentina, not Gordon, who wrote Graves in January of 1949, asking if he might help them solve this cold case. The Wassons and Graves struck up a lively correspondence, and in September of 1952, the poet mailed the couple an article by archaeologist Robert Heiser in an obscure pharmaceutical bulletin, which mentioned that ethnobotanist Richard Schultes had indeed found entheogenic fungi being employed for healing purposes by the indigenous peoples of Mexico. The Wassons headed to Oaxaca the following year. As an aside, the ultimate results of their studies of the demise of the Roman Emperor Claudius were published in the Botanical Museum leaflets of Harvard University as, quote, "The Death of Claudius, or Mushrooms for Murderers." I'll put a reference in the show notes at the end of this episode. At the time he received the article from Graves, Wasson was a wealthy banker working for J.P. Morgan Jr. An odd and little reported note is that J.P. Morgan, like Wasson, had also attended Harvard College, and that Morgan had studied mycology at Harvard and actually supported the building of the Farlow Mycological Herbarium at Harvard, where Schultes and Wasson's mushroom collections are stored today. Wasson, however, had no formal scientific training. After reading the Heiser paper and then Schultes' first-hand scientific accounts of his field research, he was consumed by the desire to learn more and then experience these mushrooms firsthand. Like Lorenzo de' Medici, Wasson was able to engage extraordinary talents into his efforts. Whereas Lorenzo hired Leonardo and Michelangelo, Wasson, like Lorenzo, with ample resources and an inquiring mind, brought on board a number of leading lights in related fields, not only Schultes himself, who by then had a tenured post at the Botanical Museum at Harvard, but also Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist, who synthesized LSD, as well as classic scholars, particularly Carl Ruck of Boston University, as well as other linguists and mycologists. Based on Schultes' advice, Wasson was able to organize and fund 10 expeditions to Oaxaca and participate in a series of veladas, the sacred mushroom ceremonies among the Mazatecs. An account of one such experience, entitled Seeking the Magic Mushrooms, was published in Life magazine on May 13, 1957, which soon made Wasson the world's most famous mycologist.
To purchase Dr. Mark Plotkin's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, or his first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, visit your local bookseller or order from Amazon.com.
So let me give a timeline, because the history of the discovery of these mushrooms by the outside world is quite convoluted and different accounts conflict. In 1916, William Safford published his paper saying that Teonanacatl was not a mushroom, it was the peyote cactus. In 1919, an Austrian physician living in Mexico by the name of Blas Pablo Recco published a paper saying that Teonanacatl was indeed a fungus. In 1923, Recco wrote the Smithsonian saying that Teonanacatl was indeed a fungus. That was the letter that Schultes later stumbled across. In 1936, linguist Robert Whiteliner went to Oaxaca, helped by Durantes, the same family that later helped me when I visited Oaxaca, and was actually able to collect a sample of the sacred mushroom, but it was poorly preserved and not able to be identified by scientists. In 1938, the anthropologist Jean Bassett Johnson was able to view the ceremony in Oaxaca, although he tragically perished a few years later during World War II in North Africa. The same year, Schultes went to Oaxaca, joined forces with Recco, and found and collected the magic mushrooms. He published this in the Botanical Museum leaflets, and very few people paid attention. In 1949, Wasson wrote Graves about the death of Claudius. In 1952, Graves sends the paper to Wasson talking about Schultes' findings in Oaxaca. In 1953, Wasson ran his first expedition to Oaxaca, accompanied by Whiteliner. In 1955, Wasson becomes the first Westerner that we know of to participate in a velada, in a mushroom ceremony. It's important to note that the first ceremony that Wasson participated in, he was not invited to take the sacred mushrooms. He observed the shaman and was later stunned to find out when the shaman made what seemed to Wasson an absurd and incorrect prediction. Let me read an extraordinary story about what happened during Wasson's first velada, Wasson's first mushroom ceremony. As published in a wonderful book called Shroom by Andy Letcher. I'll put the reference in the show notes. Late in the day, after much fruitless searching, during which the taciturn Mazatec locals proved more than a little resident on the subject of mushrooms, they discovered to their surprise that their local guide, the one-eyed Aurelio Carreras, was himself a curandero, that is, a shaman. After a little persuasion, he agreed to hold a velada, Wasson's term for the indigenous all-night mushroom vigil, to determine the health and well-being of Wasson's son Peter. Although only Aurelio consumed mushrooms in this case, Wasson was at last able to witness and make detailed records of an authentic ceremony. He politely humored Aurelio when the results of the mushroom-assisted divination revealed Peter to be not in Boston, as Wasson believed, but in New York and in a state of some emotional turmoil. On returning home, however, Wasson found things to be exactly as predicted. The enterprising Peter had made use of his father's absence to actually hold a party in their New York apartment and was indeed in a state of adolescent turmoil, having been spurned by his girlfriend. Aurelio, Wasson noted, had scored a, quote, palpable hit. So let's talk a bit about the effect the fungi have had on our culture, our history, and our arts. In the show notes attached to this episode, you can see John Tenniel's famous illustration of Alice in Wonderland, where Alice meets the hookah-smoking caterpillar atop the magic mushroom. This was published around 1865. I stared at this drawing for years, since I started reading Alice in Wonderland as a kid, and I saw her looking up at this caterpillar with the face of a man, which is what you see when you first look at this illustration. But when you take mushrooms, you realize the genius of the artist, because with the fungi and you're being bemushroomed, you can see things differently than you've seen before, which is part of the magic in magic mushrooms. Tenniel's drawing is an optical illusion. If you look carefully, it's not only a caterpillar with the face of a man, you can also see that it's just a regular caterpillar with head and legs. One of the great effects of experiencing other realities is to be able to see the world, no matter how well you know it, in a completely different way. How important is Alice in Wonderland in this whole story of what's become the Psychedelic Renaissance? Where did this come from? The current thinking is that Lewis Carroll never took hallucinogenic plants or mushrooms, but he did read books like The Seven Sisters of Sleep, written by Mordecai Cook, who discussed hallucinogens in several of his publications. He was a fascinating character. A true Renaissance scientist, he wrote about marine organisms, reptiles, and fungi. His most famous work, as I said, was The Seven Sisters of Sleep, focusing on 7 hallucinogenic species. He was also quite a rascal. He may have written The Seven Sisters of Sleep, but he didn't spend all of his time sleeping. He was awake long enough to produce at least 7 children by a woman who was not his wife. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland inspired countless kids, ethnobotanists, and even an X-rated musical film. And the most famous hallucinogenic rock song of all time, White Rabbit by the Jefferson Airplane. I'll put the lyrics in the endnotes. Quote, 1 pill makes you larger and 1 pill makes you small. And you've just had some kind of mushroom and your mind is moving slow. People like me who grew up in the 60s will get flashbacks just reading the lyrics. The earliest record of magic mushrooms come from a plateau in Algeria. This is the so-called bee man, It's a petroglyph, a stone carving, made probably between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago. The bee-man's body is covered in mushrooms, and he has the face of a bee. Interestingly enough, the relationship between magic mushrooms and honey is long and deep. When I first went to Oaxaca 20 years ago and spent time with the Mazatecs, all of the mushrooms during the ceremonies were served in honey. 500 years ago, Francisco Hernandez, physician to the King of Spain, who had been sent to Mexico to learn new medicines from the indigenous peoples, wrote that the Aztec tradition was to serve magic mushrooms in honey. In fact, the Spanish conquistadors were horrified by this bizarre custom of consuming the fungi. Bizarre in their eyes, that is, but sacred in the eyes and minds of the indigenous peoples. Interestingly, when I visited Oaxaca, all of the paramount shamans that I met were women. I'm often asked about shamanism in the neotropics. In my experience, almost all true shamans are men, except for two cultures, the Mazatecs in Oaxaca and the Shipibos in the Peruvian Amazon, where the most noted shamanic healers tend to be women. But there are exceptions. There are female shamans in other tribes. And just like in Wasson's first experience with the shaman amongst the Mazatec was in fact a man. A few words about fungi biology. Many people seem to believe that fungi are essentially some sort of flowering plant that were simply too lazy to photosynthesize or not smart enough to produce chlorophyll. Nothing could be further from the truth. Fungi are their own kingdom and are more closely related to humans than our plants. Let me say that again. Fungi are their own kingdom and are more closely related to humans than plants are. They are more closely related to animals than plants are. So fungi are not an offshoot of the plant kingdom. They are a completely different standalone group. The first fungi probably appeared on Earth about 2 billion years ago. In fact, 400 million years ago, the predominant forests on the planet were fungi. These were fungi called prototaxotes, mushrooms that were over 25 feet high. They once dominated the earth and were still finding new genera of fossil fungi and living fungi. I think fungi in many ways may prove to be the most promising source of new natural medicinal products. In fact, the idea that we found all the hallucinogenic fungi and plants in the world is absolute nonsense. Let me give you a concrete example from the Amazon. For decades, peoples have been hearing about piri-piri, a supposedly safe and effective female contraceptive. When scientists asked the indigenous peoples to show them piri-piri, the indigenous peoples pointed to a sedge. Now, sedge is a grass-like plant which is pretty chemically inert. How could this make sense if this plant had little chemical value that it could be used as a safe and effective contraceptive? One of the leading ethnobotanists of our time is Dr. Glenn Shepard, who's lived and worked with indigenous people of the Amazon for decades. Only after being with people in the Peruvian Amazon for over a decade was he able to find out what piri-piri actually was. Essentially, the secret behind piri-piri is that the sedge is infected by a fungus. This fungus is related to ergot that we covered in an episode in season 1, which was an extraordinarily hallucinogenic fungus used and even feared in medieval Europe. Ergot was, in fact, the inspiration for Albert Hofmann, one of the greatest natural product chemists that ever lived, to create LSD, which was based on synthetic versions of ergot alkaloids. Keep in mind that nature is the greatest chemist of all time and has been creating weird and wonderful chemicals for 3 billion years. I firmly believe that there are still wonderful, interesting, dangerous, hallucinogenic chemicals for us to find if we protect Mother Nature and if we're patient and humble enough to learn from indigenous peoples who live closer to nature and can teach us the secrets of the natural world around us and around them. At the Amazon Conservation Team, where I work, we're trying to honor this idea by having worked with over 100 different South American indigenous groups to improve protection of about 80 million acres of ancestral rainforest. but this needs to be done everywhere in the world in terms of protecting nature and protecting the cultures that inhabit these ecosystems. It's interesting to note that of all the great finds that have come from the tropics, one of the most important discoveries of fungi comes from Lapland, of all places, and the indigenous peoples in the north of Finland. The medicinal fungus that I'm referring to was learned of actually in a random screen. This is where scientists collect one of everything and then test it in the laboratory. The fungus produces cyclosporin, an immunosuppressant. That is, it has the ability to selectively suppress components of the immune system, which therefore makes organ transplant surgery possible. We're now finding that there are fungi in the ruins of Chernobyl that are eating radioactive waste. We found fungi feeding on petroleum byproducts and turning the hydrocarbons into carbohydrates. Paul Stamets, my friend and colleague, who will one day win the Nobel Prize for Mycology, if we ever establish one, has said time and time again, fungi can save the world. When I was in Oaxaca 20 years ago, the great shaman that I had the honor and privilege to work with, Julieta, had told me that ever since she was a kid, 2 varieties of magic mushrooms had disappeared due to the changing climate. Even when Wasson arrived there in the mid-50s, things were already starting to change. Culturally, as more of the outside world was beginning to press in, and climatically, as the climate was beginning to change. Wasson, who was a great team builder, enlisted the help of experts like Roger Heim, who was a leading mushroom taxonomist, and, as I said, Albert Hofmann, the great chemist. And it was Wasson that brought Hofmann to Oaxaca. Hofmann, having already invented and tried LSD, knew quite a bit about hallucinogens. And it was Hofmann who isolated the active components in the mushrooms, psilocybin and psilocin. He was able to extract these chemicals, describe them, and actually synthesize them from scratch. Some have referred to Wasson, Schultes, and Hofmann as the Holy Trinity of ethnomycology, with the understanding that the knowledge of these plants was first developed by indigenous peoples themselves. But in a later episode, I want to talk about this Holy Trinity should be considered a holy quintet, because we have to include both Valentina Wasson and the shaman Maria Sabina. Now, Wasson was an excellent writer, having been a journalist before he was a banker, so he really knew how to describe things, and he wrote about one of his mushroom experiences, a fantastic quote. "I saw geometric patterns, angular, and the richest colors. These grew into architectural structures. The stonework, in brilliant colors, bending beyond the reach of light and vistas measureless to man. The architectural visions seemed to be oriented and seemed to belong to the architecture described by the visionaries of the Bible. In the full moonlight of Oaxaca, the bouquet on the shaman's table assumed the dimensions and shape of an imperial conveyance, a triumphant car drawn by creatures known only to mythology." End of quote. The Mazatecs, at least when I got there, and certainly even when Wasson was there, were already practicing a syncretic religion. It was primarily Christian, primarily Catholic, with many elements of the traditional indigenous religions in terms of the mushrooms. A great description of why these indigenous syncretic religions are so appealing was written by an anthropologist who studied peyote. Quote, "The white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus. The Indian goes into his church, takes peyote, and talks to Jesus." End of quote. This is a recurring theme in the plants of the gods, that much of religion, and I don't mean just indigenous religion, some of our own Western religions, such as Christianity or Judaism, may well have originated or certainly been impacted by these magic plants and fungi. The Immortality Key, as I mentioned before, written by Brian Morarescu, details finding a chalice from an ancient Greek settlement in Catalonia, northern Spain, which had mind-altering substances inside. The more that we learn of the effects of these plants these fungi have had, the more we realize they've have played a fundamental role in making us who we are. Consider, for example, the stoned ape hypothesis. The late ethnobotanist Terence McKenna had a theory. About 200,000 years ago, when our species progressed greatly and developed much bigger brains and presumably had the gift of language, was all tied, according to Terence, to the discovery of magic mushrooms. It was this consciousness expansion that eventually allowed our species to dominate the planet. Complementary to this is the drunken monkey hypothesis, which says that primates came down from the trees to eat the ripest fruits on the ground. Ripe fruits have sugars that turn to alcohol, which is how wine is created. In this case, the hypothesis is that our primate ancestors became humans because of wine. Both could be right. Neither might be right. The field is endlessly intriguing. Nobody knew there were magic mushrooms outside of the indigenous peoples before Schultes went to the far ends of the earth in the 1930s to find magic mushrooms. But here's the ironic aspect. Schultes spent his whole life in Massachusetts, born and bred and raised, except for the 14 years he spent in the Amazon and the year he spent in Mexico. He lived in Massachusetts. However, we now know there are at least 5 and maybe as many as 10 species of magic mushrooms growing in Massachusetts, according to mycologist Giuliani Furci. But ethnobotanists know when you want to find out the secrets, you have to go to the indigenous peoples. When you want to find out where things are, you go to the back of the book or the table of contents to find what page you need to turn to. Indigenous peoples can be seen as the table of contents and the index to nature. So like the Wizard of Oz, what Schultes learned by going to the far ends of the earth, or to the other earths, or to other planets, or other realities, is there's no place like home, with Mother Nature wonders are all around us. I want to conclude by talking a bit about the use of psilocybin and psilocin from these mushrooms in Western medicine. One of the great stories of the 21st century is the mainstreaming of these and other hallucinogens and entheogens into conventional Western medicine. Here's a quote from Nicholas Coetzee from the University of Wisconsin Medical School in Fantastic Fungi. Psilocybin and its active metabolite psilocin are tryptamine alkaloids, a chemical family that includes the neurotransmitter serotonin. Serotonin is present in all human beings and in many animals and plants around the world. As a neurotransmitter, serotonin regulates mood, sexual activity, appetite, sleep, memory and learning, body temperature, some social behaviors, and certain cardiovascular processes. Because of its chemical similarity to serotonin, psilocin activates some of the same brain receptors that serotonin acts upon. These receptors affect change, the way that neurons function, and how they respond to stimuli. This in turn leads to altered perceptions and cognition and can sometimes produce mystical or spiritual experience in people. Psilocybin mushrooms produce several compounds in addition to psilocybin, including biocystin and norbiocystin, which are also known to be psychoactive. They're present in smaller amounts than psilocybin, but may affect the mushroom experience by their presence. In our studies, we're using pure psilocybin synthesized in my laboratory. This raises the question whether an experience with the psilocybin mushroom is identical to one with pure psilocybin. I suspect they're not exactly the same. As we've seen time and time again, in Plants of the Gods, these admixtures can have complex chemical and biochemical impacts on the human body and mind. When these plant and fungal substances are studied in the laboratory, they're typically studied in terms of one alkaloid. This is why shamans and other indigenous healers can sometimes do things, can sometimes treat things, can sometimes cure things that our own Western physicians cannot. Roland Griffiths, a professor of psychology at Johns Hopkins University, which, as I said, I regard as the leading center for the study of hallucinogens and entheogens in Western medicine, wrote about the use of psilocybin. Quote, volunteers reported experiences that appeared virtually identical to the mystical experiences described by spiritual and religious figures throughout the ages. A sense of interconnectedness of all persons and things, sacredness, and an authoritative sense that the experience was more real and true than everyday waking consciousness was not uncommon. Matthew Johnson, a psychiatrist also at Johns Hopkins, wrote, quote, "From very ill to very healthy, profound changes to outlook and personality can result from one well-facilitated dose. Patients regularly report that the experience clearly ranks among the most meaningful experiences of their lives, with positive and enduring change to attitude, behavior, mood, outlook, and spirituality." My pal Michael Pollan, who wrote two of the most important books about the psychedelic renaissance, wrote, "It has been difficult in the past to obtain research dollars to study drugs designed to help people who aren't sick." This is a very shamanic concept, that you take these drugs, these medicines, to not get sick, in addition to when you are sick. This is the field of preventative medicine. Shamans have been doing this for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Magic mushrooms and the psilocybin molecule and other entheogenic substances from plants are now being used to treat so-called incurable ailments. These are diseases like PTSD, particularly amongst combat veterans, drug addiction, trauma, obsessive-compulsive disorder, end-of-life anxiety amongst terminal cancer patients, other anxieties, and even depression, are in many cases responding well to these mind-altering substances. And not only are fungi being used to treat these intractable ailments, but fungi are now being used to produce biomaterials. Meat substitute, you can even buy mushroom jerky, mushroom leather, hats, packing materials, fibers for high-end clothing, auto parts, hats, bags, furniture, shoes, and even yoga mats. Mushrooms are increasingly a part of gourmet cuisine, and they're being used by people like Paul Stamets and others to clean up polluted soil and water. Serious pollution, from petroleum byproducts to radioactive waste. These are billion-dollar industries which are taking off now. Let me be clear. Protection of nature should not be a utilitarian exercise. We should protect and steward and honor and worship Mother Nature for ethical reasons, in my personal opinion. However, the utilitarian argument to not destroy forests and boglands and coral reefs and rainforests because they may and because they do harbor useful compounds, useful species, is a very important one that needs to be made the world over. And certainly, the role of fungi will be paramount.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, share, and listen to our previous episodes on plants like ayahuasca, cannabis, and opium. We appreciate your support for the protection of knowledge and biodiversity by the Amazon Conservation Team. Find us on the web at amazonteam.org. In our next episode, Dr. Plotkin will discuss the Holy Trinity of ethnomycology, featuring the intertwined stories of Richard Schultes, Gordon Wasson, and Albert Hofmann. Here's a quick preview.
People talk about the Holy Trinity of ethnomycology, the study of people and fungi. That Holy Trinity would be my mentor, Richard Schultes, Albert Hofmann, who analyzed and created LSD and extracted psilocybin from magic mushrooms, and Gordon Wasson, who did the most detailed studies of the Mexican mushrooms. However, the term is a misnomer. It shouldn't be Holy Trinity, it should be the Holy Quintet, because it overlooks the fundamental contributions of two women, Valentina Wasson and Maria Sabina. Tune in for more information.